of allegiance of a new member. Announcements by the presiding officer. Members, I wish to make the following announcements. I have received a request for leave of absence from the Deputy Chief Secretary and Secretary of Finance and the Economy for today's sitting. The leave requested is granted. Assembly bills sent back from Cabinet. Assembly laws brought back from Parliament. Petitions, papers.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. On behalf of the Deputy Chief Secretary and Secretary of Finance and the Economy, I have the pleasure of laying the following paper, the Tobago House of Assembly Monthly Budget Report as at end of December 2019.
Presentation of reports from Dispute Resolution Commission. Questions to secretaries, questions for oral answer. Members, the minority leader is absent, therefore the questions would be put on the next order paper.
request for leave to move the adjournment of the Assembly on definite matters of urgent public importance, statements by secretaries or assistant secretaries, personal explanations, introduction of bills, motions relating to the business or sittings of the Assembly, and moved by a secretary or assistant secretary. Public business, Executive Council business. Motion.
Secretary of Health, Wellness, and Family Development.
Madam Presiding Officer, my colleagues on this side and those on the minority, the motion reads, whereas under the 5th United Nations Sustainable Development Goal of gender equality, the second target is to eliminate all forms of violence against all women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. And whereas the safety of our women and girls against the threat of domestic violence and other forms of abuse continues to be a concern for us here in Tobago, be it resolved that this House urge all Tobagonians to reject and eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls. And be it further resolved that this House form a committee of key stakeholders led by the Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development to leverage the division's strategy for eliminating all forms of gender-based violence, as well as support the commitment statement made at the Nairobi conference in November 2019. Madam Presiding Officer, the order of my discourse would be as follows. I'll set the context, and such context would be within the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 5, more particularly Goal 5.2. I'll explain VAWG and GBV. I'll provide data and information with respect to international experience, more particularly in the Seychelles. I'll point to Trinidad and Tobago's situation and Tobago. I will look at those efforts that are or were already instituted, and I'll look at our commitments made. The expectation is my colleagues would add to this discourse in some of those areas, including trafficking and other forms of exploitation. Madam Presiding Officer, violence against women and girls deprives women and girls of the ability to enjoy fundamental freedoms, and this is an obstacle to equality between women and men. Since the 1990s, the discourse emerged, and we now have this as part of the 2030 agenda. Madam Presiding Officer, VAWG deprives women of the ability to enjoy these freedoms, as I mentioned earlier. In 2015, 193 member states of the United Nations agreed that we should pursue a more sustainable future for all. In pursuit of this agenda, Madam Presiding Officer, we are seeking to achieve 17 goals by 2030. Goal 5 speaks to gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. Just continue. In particular, Goal 5 speaks to the elimination of all forms of violence against women and girls in public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. According to UN Women, gender-based violence, in particular VAWG, is one of the most common forms of insecurity facing citizens in the Caribbean. Madam Presiding Officer, traditional gendered roles inform the vulnerability our men face, in that they tend to be involved in violence and organized crime. with respect to our women and girls, they tend to be more vulnerable to physical and sexual abuse. The UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women of 1993 defines violence against women and girls as any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts as coercion, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. Gender-based violence can be defined as acts of physical, mental, or social abuse, including sexual violence, with some type of force. For example, violence, threats, manipulation, and so on. Madam Presiding Officer, this particular issue is important for us as a division and as an island. We will recall that on coming into office, this assembly moved to realign the various divisions. And in this case, the Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development was realigned, and there's a refocusing of matters with respect to family. And the issues with respect to women and girls are central to that discourse. Madam Presiding Officer, I will want to point to what is happening in other regions, as I said earlier in my outline. Having had this Chisel's experience, where they felt that it was important for them to look at what is happening and indeed what is its costing. This is important for us to look at. In the Seychelles, they discussed and they costed. It was found that $17.3 million was spent annually in the Seychelles with respect to violence against women and girls. 1.2% of the GDP of the Seychelles, factoring in the cost of healthcare, the justice system, the social services, as well as loss of earnings in the country's economy, felt at the VAWG. Recognizing the major issue that this is for the Seychelles, they have since established a shelter for women of gender-based violence to provide a place of refuge, as well as they've been looking at what the data is saying to them. Because for them, this is important because looking at what the data is showing in a 2016 study, 59% of the women in the Seychelles had experienced violence once in their lifetime. Most of this occurred with their intimate partners. This sample of 1,560 respondents reported that they had physical intimate partner violence. 78% of those were women who confirmed that this occurred before age 18. Since then, the Seychelles had moved towards having a national gender policy. Their mission is to achieve gender equality. They felt it's important to provide a framework that will allow for the gender equality for them to pursue that particular area nationally. But when we look at what is happening globally, 6 out of 10 women will experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. Looking at Trinidad and Tobago, Madam Presiding Officer, violence against women remains one of the most widespread human rights violations, yet one of the least prosecuted crimes. In the Caribbean, Madam Presiding Officer, many plans have been developed, and many laws, which I'll point to later, have been developed. Some continue to build capacity to tackle gender-based violence. Some have set up network of advocates like Carryman. Others have looked towards, like in Jamaica, they have looked towards national plans of action, all with a view to eliminating gender-based violence. In islands like Barbados, with the support of CARICOM and the OECS, the assessment of the prevalence of GBV that was undertaken. Other countries like Belize, Grenada, Antigua, and Barbuda have embarked on projects such that they will look at VWAG. According to the National Women's Health Survey of Trinidad and Tobago, and this one was undertaken in 2017, this final report, with the support of the IDB, found that, and from the sample of 1,079 women ages 15 to 64, they found that 30% of ever-partnered women experience physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. 6% of these persons in the 12 months prior to the data is 2017 data. All these negative consequences that arise with respect to intimate partner violence for women is an area of concern for us, in that 1 in 3 women remain quiet about this experience, and most survivors didn't seek help because of fear and shame. When we look at between 2010 and 2016, just to share some of the data, there were 15,000 reports of violence recorded. 72% of these reports were related to women. And during the same period, 2010 to 2016, 81 were domestic violence deaths. 58% were women. Just recently, looking at the Trinidad Express, as recent as the 21st of February and also the 24th of February, where the Trinidad Express recorded and the caption, "Bathed in blood, mom beaten to death." This occurred in El Dorado, Trinidad, where following a report, the police found a man standing at the door covered in blood and incoherently point to the bedroom where the victim lay. 2 days prior to that, we had a situation recorded in the Guardian newspaper of the 21st of February where a woman from Siparia was also chopped to death. And there are many, many situations like those. In our own division, as we continue to confront this issue, last year we recalled 41 women coming in for assistance. They came for assistance, they were seeking refuge. There were issues with respect to domestic violence occurring in their homes and came to the division for support, for refuge, for advice, for counseling. Madam Presiding Officer, this issue is too widespread for us to sweep under the carpet. Apart from being widespread, this is impacting the stability of the health of families and communities. VAWG is multifaceted and occurs at the individual level, at the relationship level, in communities, and within our society. With respect to the individual level, what we've noticed is the men providing information in terms of experience that they have had from childhood, becoming alcohol users, and this impacting on these families. With respect to the women, they've recorded abuse as a child, and these issues continue even into their adult life. In communities, we notice that women might be isolated because of little social support. The support we knew of early in our earlier life and growing up appears to no longer exist. For our men, the peer group condone this kind of behavior. With respect to the men, again, you find within their families, they control the resources, they control decision-making. Within our society, gender roles are rigid. They're defined and enforced. Madam Presiding Officer, because this is so widespread, the government of Trinidad and Tobago has put a framework in place as part of the response. But one may argue that notwithstanding the legal framework, our women and girls continue to experience this particular issue. The rights of our women and girls to be safe from harm is enshrined in law. And as I said earlier, there are pieces of legislation that have been passed. We have had the Domestic Violence Act of 1991. We have had the Sexual Offences Act of 2012. We have had the Children's Act of 2012. We have had the Child Marriage Act of 2017. However, delays in the judicial system and other factors create challenges for women and girls. There have been other conventions that we have agreed to. So we have conventions on the right of the child, signed in 1990 and ratified in 1991. We have the CEDAW Convention. We have the Montevideo Consensus. The SDGs I pointed to earlier, we have that we're pursuing all the way up to 2030. But even as far back as 1994, the Cairo Program of Action set out a program of action to empower women and girls for the benefit of their families, communities, and nations. In 1995, we had the Beijing Platform of Action, which called on governments to adopt, implement, and review legislation to ensure that we eliminate VAWG. We have as well the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women. And more recently, in 2019, we've had the Nairobi Summit, where the effort was to accelerate the promise made 25 years ago. At that time, the commitment was to move towards zero sexual and gender-based violence and harmful practices against women and girls. In fact, ending gender-based violence and harmful practices. All these efforts have been instituted, Madam Presiding Officer, but yet the safety of our women and girls continue to be threatened. What have we been doing in Tobago? As pointed earlier, that we have refocused our division. We've been working with several partners. So some of our services that we continue to provide and those that we have improved include our recommissioning of our Community Mediation Center, or strengthening of our child and family services, or program for adolescent mothers, or decentralization of our community social work. Other services we provide our Child and Adolescent Center. We have collaborations with Family Planning of Trinidad and Tobago, and we have our gender unit as well. The intention is that we strengthen our existing framework to support the challenge that we face. We believe that if we pursue and we strengthen our framework, we will be able to address the following. We believe that the strategies that we have can be much more multi-sectorial, and we believe at the end of this discourse that we will have all other sectors coming on board with us so that we strengthen these areas. We believe that we can enhance the capacity of communities to identify issues and point them out so that we can intervene early. With respect to our services, we think that as we move forward, we can look at a standardization of care for those persons so affected. And of course, the efforts that we continue to point to where we become much more gender responsive. We have set up a shelter for management of persons who have experienced gender-based violence. At the present time, we've had to make some adjustments because we will have to relocate in short order. But as we go forward, we intend to collaborate with other stakeholders to provide support for persons who are affected by domestic violence. Our policies for domestic violence in the workplace, we expect that as we continue to discuss we will finalize those. The issues with respect to the costing of violence against women is important for us because as a health sector and as a social sector, we want to pursue what is going to cost or what it has been costing us, be it for hospital stay, be it for shelter, be it for counseling, be it for time spent with respect to speaking with the police, be it with respect to cost of imprisonment, all of those areas, loss of productivity for those persons affected, and all of those. These situations that we face, we want to have a sense as to what that is costing us, because indeed it is costing us a bit. We are approaching the month of March, Madam Presiding Officer, an important month for us as we address the issue with respect to women and girls. Soon, March 8th will be here, and we are pointing to and we intend to celebrate that day. Our theme is, I am Generation Equality, realizing women's rights. Hashtag each for equal. An equal world is what we pursue, an equal world in an enabled world. I believe that together we can challenge the stereotypes, but we must do so together. We believe that gender equality is essential for the economics of this island. Madam Presiding Officer, given the situation with respect to violence against women and girls, this division would want to put on the table a few things. One, that we need a public health approach to addressing this issue, whereas we use the framework to define the problem, address those risk factors, develop prevention strategies, and implement these strategies throughout. We need all sectors to participate. The Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development cannot do it alone if we have to eliminate violence against women and girls. On the next opportunity that I have to speak in the wrap-up, I will address the issues, some of the issues with respect to moving each for equal, accelerating our efforts with the support of others as we seek to eliminate violence against women and girls. I thank you.
Members, the question is, whereas under the 5th United Nations Sustainable Development Goal of gender equality, the second target is to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. And whereas the safety of our women and girls against the threat of domestic violence and other forms of abuse continues to be a concern for us here in Tobago, be it resolved that this House urge all Tobagonians to reject and eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls, and be it further resolved that this House form a committee of the key stakeholders led by the Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development to leverage the division's strategy for eliminating all forms of gender-based violence, as well as support the commitment statement made at the Nairobi conference in November 2019. Member for Palatuvier, Lansfamy, Speyside.
Thank you very much, Madam Presiding Officer. Thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this very important motion. The motion requires that this House be resolved to urge all Tobagonians to reject and eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls. Let me say from the onset, we agree with that resolution. Secondarily, it resolves that this House forms a committee of key stakeholders led by the Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development to leverage the division's strategy for eliminating all forms of gender-based violence, as well as support the commitment statement made at the Nairobi conference in November 2019. And with regards to that secondary resolution, we agree with some reservations. And I start there by saying we agree with some reservations because if we look through what has happened in this House over the past 3 years, we have resolved for quite a lot to set up committees, to investigate quite a lot, and to do quite a lot. And we seldom get a sense of what happens after the resolution is passed. And if we are saying today, Madam Presiding Officer, that this is an extremely important issue, and we agree it is extremely important, then this motion cannot just go to a committee to die a natural death. It has to be a situation, this has to be a case, where if a committee is set up as the motion proposes, that we will not just investigate where we are in terms of violence against women and girls, but we will have actionable recommendations, and we will find a way to bring back to this House the report of that committee and to actually action these things. And I'm not saying that this will automatically be the case in this regard. However, given that we have set up several committees previously for several other reasons, and in most of the cases we have not heard, well, at least the public has not heard, what is the next step? What are the recommendations of these committees? One can't help but question if this matter will die a natural death as others. But we hope not. And so with that small reservation, we do support this motion. The truth is, Trinidad and Tobago can be perceived and is perceived by many as a violent nation. And if we are honest with ourselves, if we look at the statistics on crime in general, it is fair to say that we are a violent bunch of people. But being a citizen of this country and living here, it doesn't feel as if we are a violent people. But then again, I live in the countryside on the small of two islands, the less violent of two islands. And so it's easy to feel as if we are not as violent as the statistics show. But it is easy for the world to view us as a violent bunch of people, which is sad because we are also seen as the happiest bunch of people. And I don't know if happiness and violence goes in the same category. But when we look specifically at gender-based violence and we look at the reports annually from the TTPS, from the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, we will see that quite a number of our women folk and young women at that are unjustifiably murdered. And that is a cause for concern for anyone and should be a cause for concern for all of us. If we look at that 2017 report as referenced by the Secretary of Health, it shows that 1 in 3 women in Trinidad and Tobago experiences some form of intimate partner violence, and in particular domestic violence. 1 in 3. That is extremely high for a country our size and for a population our size. It means that nearly 130,000 of our women, let's put it into numbers, nearly 130,000 of our women experience some sort of violence. That is a lot. That is a staggering figure. But it also speaks to a broader Caribbean culture, unfortunately. Because it's not just a Tobago or Trinidad issue, or a Barbados or a Jamaican issue, but when we look around the Caribbean region, it is quite possible that the Caribbean region ranks among the top regions for violence against women. And that is unfortunate because, again, violence for some reason cannot and should not be associated with warm waters and white sandy beaches and coconut palms and sea breezes. I mean, people who live in this kind of environment should rightfully be the most peaceful on the planet. So it means that something is accounting for that anomaly. Something is accounting for a blotch in our character as a region. And so it has to be addressed. It needs to be addressed not just by us in the Tobago House of Assembly, but it also needs to be addressed nationally and regionally. It's something that CARICOM has to take up and treat with in a much more judicious manner. But what is it in our culture that gives us this propensity to be violent towards our women and girls? And I tell you, a large part of it is cultural. A large part of it is how we have been trained and how we have been raised. A large part of it is related to even our religious beliefs. And yes, I am one of those who you will consider to be very fervent and going to church every weekend and so on and active in church. But the reality is our religious upbringing, and might I dare say, in some parts of our Christian religious upbringing, and we can include the other major faiths in the country, Islam and Hinduism, have in many ways taught us to be violent towards women and girls. And if it did not teach us to do that, it also taught us to be silent where violence against women and girls are concerned. Our warped view of what manhood and womanhood, what those are, of what love and family means, and those are reinforced in our sermons. This sense of women and girls not being equal to men and boys. And yes, we have known for a long time that this is a man's world, and unfortunately so. But we have to do more to make this world and our world a more equitable place for women and for girls. And that must be said. And it must be said more frequently by male leaders in our society. Those of us who are men and consider ourselves to be men. And I don't want to go down that whole gender notion because people have a myriad of definitions for what that is. I am still in the category of things being either black or white, male or female. But those of us who consider ourselves to be men and are leaders in our society, not just at the political level, but also in the civil society, at our church, in our churches and in our youth groups and sport groups and teachers in the classroom, we have to make a much more bold effort in speaking firmly against gender-based violence, and in particular against violence with regards to our women and our girls. We have to change our interactions with our women and our girls. And I understand that some things are traditional and some things have been that way for as long as we have known it, for as long as we have known ourselves as boys and men in this society. We have been making catcalls to women across the streets, hurling sexual requests at them publicly. We have tried our very best to bully our women and girls into providing sexual favors. And I'm talking in the third person because this is a societal problem. It's not a problem that is unique to one particular group of our society. It's not unique to men and boys of African descent, or men and boys of East Indian descent, or men and boys who are Christian, or men and boys who are Islamic or Hindus. It is a problem across the society. And so all of us must take some responsibility. And not just men, but even women in our society. And even as we are preparing to set up this committee, we have to look at the role that women and mothers play in perpetuating violence against women and girls. Because I've often said, many of our toxic men in our society were raised by women, not even men. And they learned the toxicity from their mothers, not even men. So that too must be factored in the equation as we discuss and as we debate what to do. When we look at who is at risk, the United Nations tells us that around the world, women and girls who are from low socioeconomic status tend to be at a higher risk of violence than women of higher status within the society. And that's obvious. It's obvious because the women of higher status within the society tend to be the women who had access to some form of formal education beyond secondary schooling. They tend to be the women who are employed and can make their own money. And if push come to shove, they can start their own cars and drive off and leave their wicked husbands behind. But women who are from low economic or socioeconomic standing within the society, who are not as privileged, to lead financially independent lives, they have an even more difficult time than other women within the society. And that's just one of the factors that we have to grapple with as we look at not just rejecting violence against women and girls, but also looking at what should we do about it. How do we fix it? And so there is some correlation to socioeconomic status. Across the world, we also see that immigrants are at high risk. And that is something that we need to pause a while on. With the recent upheavals in Venezuela, we have seen an influx of immigrants. And it is no secret in this house, it is no secret on the streets, it is no secret anywhere in this country that immigrants, and in particular for us, our immigrants from Venezuela, have found themselves, or female immigrants from Venezuela have found themselves at a greater risk for violence being perpetrated against them. This motion speaks to human trafficking. It speaks to sexual assault. It speaks to physical violence. And our immigrant women are at risk too. And one way in which we can judge a society is not just by how it treats its citizens, but how it treats immigrants and how we treat those who unfortunately had to uproot their lives and come to this place to seek a better life. And instead of finding a better life, they have found themselves in a position where their passports and travel documents are taken away. They are held up at some brothel somewhere, at some secret sex house somewhere. Men are paying for them to come to their bachelor parties. Men are going into bars, and they're there in bars with all their breasts exposed and all private parts exposed. Let's not pretend that it's not happening. It is happening in Trinidad and Tobago. When we pick up the newspaper, we see raids happening from TTPS, and the police service is leading these women in a straight line out of these bars and brothels where they were being abused and so on. And we seemingly are turning a blind eye to it. We are normalizing it, unfortunately, because these women are not Trinidad and Tobago nationals. And that too must be placed on the table when we are having this discussion about treating with violence against women and girls. With regards to human trafficking, the U.S. Department of State has given Trinidad and Tobago a Tier 2 ranking. And I'll tell you why they have given us a Tier 2 ranking. And I'm quoting verbatim from their report. They are reporting that the government of Trinidad and Tobago does not fully meet the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. However, it is making significant efforts to do so. the government demonstrated increasing efforts compared to the previous reporting period. Therefore, Trinidad and Tobago remain on Tier 2. The government demonstrated increasing efforts by expanding authorities to collect intelligence on trafficking crimes and creating new task force on intelligence gathering and prosecution to increase law enforcement's ability to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases. It also doubled the budget for its anti-trafficking unit, increased anti-trafficking training for its officials, and initiated prosecution of a complicit official. A complicit official. All of us know that there are many complicit officials. And many of us know that there are many immigration and police officers who aid some of these same bars and brothels and so on with getting their raw material, for want of a better term. However, the government did not meet the minimum standards in several key areas. The government experienced continued delays in prosecution and had yet to secure a conviction under its anti-trafficking law. The government decreased the amount of funding for victim services. The government did not have policies or laws regulating foreign labor recruiters. So in other words, the U.S. Department of State is saying, we see some efforts. You have generally pumped more money into national security. In other words, we have placed more on the input side. But putting resources in the input, that does not equate to solving the problem. What we are interested in is the output. What are the results? And if we have human trafficking or anti-trafficking laws, but we can't prosecute people successfully on it, if it is, we could only prosecute one complicit official when we know that there are many other complicit ones, if it is that we have reduced the amount spent on victim services, meaning the amount of monies we're putting towards treating those who are victims, then it means that we are not doing as well as we ought to be doing. And there are areas for improvement in that regard. And so this issue is a very broad issue. It's a very broad issue. It requires not just the setting up of a committee, but I'm hoping that when this committee is set up, the committee will firstly identify that there is a need to re-educate our society, both men and women, re-educate our girls, or educate our girls to be much more independent. And I taught in the classroom for 7 years, and I've always said to young girls, look, you are already disadvantaged. The world not in your favor, so you might as well study a book and try to make it out on your own. Don't sell yourself short. But the reality is that many of our girls are not getting that message. Many of our girls are being taught that they ought to be subservient to their male counterparts. Because we still live in a society where it's okay to let go with cock and tie up with hen. So we tie up with hen with all kind of lasso, and they're unable to roam, they're unable to be independent, they're unable to feed as they desire, while our cocks can go roaming from neighbor yard to neighbor yard to neighbor yard. And in saying it, I'm realizing how it sounds. But it's important to understand that even in that colloquial saying is entrenched how we view girls versus boys, how we view men versus women, and the privileges we grant our men folk and our boys versus the privileges we take back and withhold from our women folk and girls. And that has to be addressed at the education level. It has to be addressed in the schools. It has to be addressed in how we teach and train our girls. And that's not just in the schools, but that also includes our churches and other social institutions, our youth clubs, our sports clubs. They too have a role to play. Our pastors and priests must preach a different sermon. And yes, the Bible requires that men be the head of their household. And most times that is preached without the responsibilities that go along with that. And that is preached from a place where you are in charge, as opposed to being preached from a place where you are supposed to take care of the women folk that you have in your household. And that must be...
You have 10 minutes more speaking time.
Sure. That too must be changed. How we sermonize gender roles in the society must be updated. We must also look at increasing efforts to investigate, to prosecute, and to convict traffickers. We have to do more, and commendations must go to the TTPS, who in January of this year opened a rapid response unit for domestic violence. Hopefully, that will result in retraining and retooling of our police officers who can treat, so that they can treat effectively with intimate partner violence. We must prosecute complicit officials and staff. We must go behind them. We must increase proactive victim identification and screening among migrant populations. We must provide adequate funding for robust victim services. We have to have robust victim services. Do we have sufficient shelter spaces? Do we have space that can allow for a woman to move with her teenage children from an abusive home? Do we have spaces that can allow for a woman to move with boys, her boy children, to a safe space? Because sometimes they can move but move alone, and it may not be safe to leave the children behind, or because of her emotional attachment to the children, she refuses to leave them behind. We need to increase training on trafficking for shelter staff, increase funding and services for language interpreters. That too has to be part of the equation, because we now have women and girls who are not proficient at speaking English and who must be protected once they are within our shores. We must increase the ability to accept victim video testimony in court proceedings. For God's sake, we are in 2020. Why is it that we require that our victim have to show up in court and have to in person testify? That should not be the case. The laws can change. I remember when the issue between Chris Brown and Rihanna came up. One thing that amazed me was that after making the report, Rihanna wanted to pull herself back out of the case. But that did not stop the state from prosecuting Chris Brown. You know why? Because it's considered a crime against the state. And so once there is evidence, the state does not need the victim to be there to prosecute the abuser. And that is where we should be heading. And so sometimes when I hear politicians say, well, choose better partners, look at who you get married to. Yes, that advice is all good. But the reality is there's more that we can do from the perspective of the state. And that includes updating our laws so that victims don't have to go through that emotional trauma of having to go to court if there's sufficient evidence. And many times we ignore the psychological impact the abuse is having, or the violent activity is having on the woman or the girl. And we wonder sometimes, why do they go back to their abusers? Why do they not follow through with the court case? The truth is, many of our women and girls are not emotionally stable and independent and strong enough to go through with the court case. And so if we don't have laws that ensure that the case is followed through with, the minute a woman feels like she can't fight up with it, and they know how our court system stop already, you will be going court over and over for donkey years for this one issue. So the minute the woman feels like she can't continue with it, the case gets dropped. And that is a big, big issue. And that's why many of the perpetrators of violence against women and girls, that's why they get off unscathed. And we need to also consider adding NGO representation to the anti-trafficking task force. So as opposed to the task force just being police officers and police trained officers, we may need to include some NGO representation there. We also need to look at substance abuse, because that too is another causative factor that we must pay attention to and we must treat with. So we can't want to treat with violence against women and girls and we don't have sufficient services to treat with substance abuse. And we're closing down the little that we have. We have to have sufficient resources to treat with substance abuse. Many of these men or these perpetrators are substance abusers. And so that too must be looked into. But as I close, Madam Presiding Officer, I want to say to the Tobagonian that is looking that we are a small society. Tobago is an island of small villages. That's why we practically know somebody from almost every family on the island, every extended family on the island, because we are an island of small villages. It is very easy for the matter of gender-based violence to get out of hand. But it also should be easier than for most other societies for us to treat with it, because physically our numbers are smaller. And so we have to work post-haste on this matter. We have to. And for those who are community leaders, you have a role to play. The days when you turn a blind eye to teachers who sexually abuse girls must come to an end. You have a responsibility. If you know that your brethren and your partner on the block looking for some young school girl or climbing through some back door, some window when the night comes, you have a responsibility. Right down the block, you could stop your brethren from committing these acts. If you know that this woman, for all she years married to this man, keep eating licks left, right, and center, and all you do about it is sit down and laugh and comment and pick up the phone and WhatsApp and videotape it to send to another neighbor, then you are equally culpable. You have a responsibility too. We have to get this right. And women, you too have a responsibility, because most times when we discuss this issue, we discuss it from the perspective that men have all these responsibilities not to be violent towards women and girls. But as I explained, many women are active participants to violence against women and girls. They are active supporters. And you women, you have a responsibility to play as well. You have a responsibility to be honest as well. Because another factor affecting all of this is that we do have some cases where false claims are made against men. That just muddies the water for everybody and creates doubt whenever victims step forward. So women, you have a responsibility. Single mothers, I know your job is hard, but if you do nothing else, treat your sons to be different than their father who left you or who treated you poorly. Treat your son to be less toxic and to be respectful of women and girls. And if we all pitch in and all do our part, then we will not just have a committee that will investigate this matter and do a report, but we will be well on our way to remedying a very vexing issue as violence against women and girls. Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer.
Assistant Secretary in the Division of Infrastructure, Quarries and the Environment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think this is one of the most comforting debate I could participate in, because it has shown my mind way back to 1997 when the said councillor was in as administrator at the time. And I recall when we were there planning to ensure that gender issues come to the forefront. And so when I saw her now as councillor in the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development, it speaks to volume. We have come a long way. Madam Speaker, Madam Presiding Officer, as I make my contribution towards this motion, I want us to be reminded in this noble house that the first step in correctly addressing any issues of this magnitude, it is the first to ensure that it is captured within the framework of the government and of the country of the national development strategies. This Tobago House of Assembly administration, in support of the present government of Trinidad and Tobago, have shown its full commitment by the implementation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is demonstrated by the alignment of the goals of our country's National Development Strategy 2016-2030, Vision 2030. May I remind this House that the National Development Strategy 2016-2030, Vision 2030, establishes a vision and broad socio-economy framework of the country's development for 2030. To achieve the goal of National Development Strategy, it is organized into 5 overarching areas, putting people first, nurturing our greatest assets. 2, delivering good governance and service excellence. 3, improving productivity through quality infrastructure and transportation. 4, building globally competitive business. And 5, placing the environment at the center of social and economical development. Madam Presiding Officer, this alignment of all forms of violence against women and girls in the public and private sphere includes trafficking and sexual abuse. Other types of exploitations are issues that were considered and correctly captured under the National Development Strategy. Madam Presiding Officer, put people first, nurturing our greatest asset. Goal 1 of this term commitments for our society will be grounded in the principle of social justice. And goal 2, we declare that the division of health, wellness, and family development delivery will be improved to better service the needs of vulnerable groups. This focus will be on the areas of protection of our families. Our support for this most vulnerable in society is a reflection of this government's recognition that women and girls are undeniably part of a vulnerable society within the society and expresses through the goals of national development and strategies. Their commitment to guide the nation forward in preparing interventions in lines with the strategy Vision 2030. Madam Presiding Officer, in acknowledgement of the reports and unreported cases of women and girls who have been victims of domestic violence, violent crimes, human trafficking in Trinidad and Tobago, this administration will continue to support the present government as they undertake a number of initiatives which are and will be aimed at the protection of women and girls so as to realize their full potential as individuals. Yes, you will recall, Madam Presiding Officer, that it is this administration of the present government of Trinidad and Tobago, PNM, that brought forward to Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago the miscellaneous provision, which is the marital bill. This bill, which was ascended to on June 22nd, 2017, outlaw child marriage in Trinidad and Tobago by increasing the legal age of marriage to 18 years. By setting the minimum age of marriage at 18 and provides citizens with the objective rather than the subjective standard of maturity, which safeguards a child, female or male, from being married when they are not physically, mentally, or emotionally ready to do so. In the commitment to protect our girls from physical and emotional abuse, this present government and the support of this THA administration, with the full support of many civil society groups, could not allow our children to marry at an age when, for example, they do not have the right to vote or enter into any contract recognized in law. A minimum age of marriage of 18 will also help to ensure that our young girls and boys are able to give their free and full consent to marry and to have the minimum level of maturity needed before marrying, which will be in the line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Madam Presiding Officer, the national policy on gender and development is worth noting, as the policy is in alignment of a number of national instruments that set standards towards the achievement of gender equality, women's empowerment, and children protection. This instrument includes the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, as my colleague mentioned, CEDAW, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the International Conference on Population Development Plan of Action, and the Beijing Platform of Action. All these were conventions and actions taken. Notwithstanding the area of gender development, the National Child Policy, Madam Presiding Officer, also quite relevant in the context of this present discussion. The National Child Policy provides long-term guidance and framework to deliver adequate and suitable interventions, such as legislation, projects, and programs, and the necessary infrastructure that will ensure the rights of a child, enhance their status, and improve the quality of lives of children. This policy affords us the opportunity to craft targeted intervention suited to our girls. The National Child Policy also consists of the following sub-policies. 1, the Child Protection Policy with the National Strategic Framework for Child Protection, the Children in Alternative Care Policy, Nursery Policy, Early Childhood Development, Framework for Children with Disability. The policy implications can see collaboration effort between the divisions here, led by the Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development, and other divisions, such as the Division of Education, Community Development, Sports, and Youth Affairs, with key responsibilities. Madam Presiding Officer, this administration continues to educate persons on crime of trafficking in persons. Also, Madam Presiding Officer, we'll be going and looking and also assisting students of primary schools and secondary schools, school safety officers, school supervisors, official employees in the hospitality and tourism industry, as well as law enforcement officers. We'll continue to educate, we continue to send messages where we can uplift and inform all these persons. In conclusion, Madam Presiding Officer, this administration of the Tobago House of Assembly stand in support with the government of Trinidad and Tobago as they continue to move aggressively to put additional systems and structures in place aimed towards the elimination of all forms of violence against women and girls in the public and private sphere, trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. This includes research and the continuous scanning of the environment to detect emerging trends and patterns to enable the designs of relevant and timely interventions into treating with the issues as they arise. This THA administration will continue to put our people first and will continue to do all that it can to nurture and protect our greatest assets. Madam Presiding Officer, it is in this context that I make my contribution and to also support the motion laid by the Councillor. With this, Madam Presiding Officer, I thank you.
Minority Councillor.
Good afternoon, members of the House. Good afternoon to the individuals who are viewing in the gallery and who are listening to us at this sitting. It's sad, Madam Presiding Officer, that the airwaves have been filled with several reports of intimate partner violence that resulted in the death of many of our women in Trinidad and Tobago. And as a result, Madam Presiding Officer, when I saw the motion, I thought, sure, this is heading in the right direction. It means that we are acknowledging that this really is an issue and that we are acknowledging that very concrete steps need to be taken. And I came into the House this afternoon, Madam Presiding Officer, hoping that we would really jumpstart that process of taking very clear steps. Hoping that this, as my colleague pointed out, does not become just one of those feel-good things that we stand up here and talk about, and then nothing happens after that. And I'm still praying and I am still hoping that that really is not what is going to happen today. Madam Presiding Officer, I want to take just a little bit of time to make a very a distinction, because depending on where you see the term and depending on who you see talking about it and depending on the kinds of statistics that we're looking at, we need to be clear on what we're talking about. Trinidad and Tobago has a Domestic Violence Act that in essence basically says we are supposed to report domestic violence and we're supposed to collect data on domestic violence. But I want to be clear that the definition of domestic violence in that act is one that is a relatively broad one. And I want to read it specifically. It says, it includes physical, sexual, emotional, or psychological or financial abuse committed by a person against a spouse, child, or any other person who is a member of the household or dependent. So I just wanted to make that clear that when the TTPS, for example, speak about domestic violence data, that they are not just talking about intimate partner violence and they are not just talking about violence against women and girls, but they are including a kind of wider definition of domestic violence. So we need to be very clear about that when we are looking at the statistics and we're talking about the statistics that's officially reported. According to the World Health Organization, if we're talking about intimate partner violence, and I am most of the times when we're talking about that or what has been said before, I think is referring more to intimate partner violence, which again refers to physical, sexual, emotional, other kinds of controlling behavior that relates to an intimate partner. So you may have intimate partner violence that is not, or you may have domestic violence according to the Domestic Violence Act that is not necessarily intimate partner violence. And I wanted us to just be clear about that and to be clear that when the TTPS is reporting on domestic violence, they may be talking about something a little different to what social science speaks of. Madam Presiding Officer, I have had very personal experiences, as many, if the if you listen to the statistics, many of us have experienced intimate partner violence one way or the other. And I have had the privilege of being outside of Trinidad and Tobago when I had the actual courage to do something about it. And I want to kind of walk through the steps that were taken because it outlines something that is critical and something that is missing in Trinidad and Tobago, and that is really a comprehensiveness of a system that is able to respond to it. So the example starts with me being at school in the US and knowing that there were counselors at the school that I could go to. Went to the counselors, explained the situation, explained that I think I was ready to access help and to see, what is available. And they were able very quickly to lead me to free legal advice, which is critical. So I went in having the situation, having little or no money, less than no money, as a matter of fact. And I was able to get free legal advice on what to do. The legal advice helped me walk through the court system because what I needed to get was what is known as a protection from abuse order. And those steps, because the social system was there to protect me, I was able to walk through the steps of getting the protection from abuse order done quickly and then delivered, because that's the next critical step. By the time I got back home to my apartment, the person who I was with at the time had already been served and was already out of the house. And I was accompanied with a police officer to go back into the home. And in addition to that, I also had the assurance that if anything happened and I called the police again, they would come. Now, I use that example because I know for a fact that if I were in Trinidad and Tobago while going through that, those steps would not have been as seamless as they were there. And that, Madam Presiding Officer, is what I thought we were coming into the house today to outline specifically what were the strategies that we are agreeing to around this U. As a matter of fact, Madam Presiding Officer, one of the things that I frequently do before we come to this house is that I share the motions with wider public, but I also specifically in this situation share the motion with people who are in the social sciences and are supposed to be part of the protective system that we should be working on. And one of the questions that was asked last night was, so Faith, what is the strategy? And I said to them, I don't know, but I am hoping that by the end of today, we know what is the strategy that we are agreeing to implement. Now, listening now, I am almost forced to conclude that the strategy really is to form the committee. And then the committee would then do the work. But as my colleague so rightly stated, we've been here and we've done that for 3 years already. And I am yet to specifically identify what any of the committees that we stood here and agreed on have done. And I don't know, Madam Presiding Officer, that that method will work in this case, because it has not worked before, and there is no reason to think that if we keep doing the same thing over and over, it is certainly going to give a different result. Madam Presiding Officer, some of the things that were highlighted that were critical, and some have already been touched on, but I want to touch again, is the fact that if we are responding to this, we need to have very clear guidelines on what next. We have first responders, and like my colleague, I would like to congratulate the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service in identifying the fact that gender-based violence is an issue and having developed that unit. And because I actually did quite a bit of work on the child protection system in Trinidad and Tobago and did the assessment of the child protection system in Trinidad and Tobago, I know that when the TTPS implemented their child protection unit, it included quite a bit of training and retraining and so forth for the officers in that unit. So I was hoping that this gender-based violence unit would also have that kind of training and retraining. I am not convinced that that is the case just yet, but we can still hope that that will actually happen. But the question that keeps coming up, Madam Presiding Officer, is for the first responders, what do they do? Where do we go? Where are, as been outlined, the safe spaces for women and children? And that is critical because we need to have the safe spaces for women and children. Ideally, Madam Presiding Officer, these safe spaces should not be run by the government. The NGO and FBO sectors and so forth should really be the ones spearheading those kinds of safe spaces. But the reality remains that the government has a responsibility to ensure that in the event that the NGOs are not picking up the slack, the government is doing it. We had what I thought was a pretty decent option within the government service, where we had those safe spaces worked out, or at least a specific safe space worked out. And again, I was hoping that after many, many, many months, because I remember being the one standing right here several months ago and asking about one of these safe spaces, the Women Empowerment Technological Center. And we were told it was up and running, but they just needed to do a little bit of refurbishment, if I am not mistaken. Only to hear now that the little refurbishment that should have happened then, because that was the official answer, Madam Presiding Officer, is yet to be complete, and that we are now about to move, and that it means that that service is not necessarily available right now. I was hoping for better news than that, Madam Presiding Officer. We also need to have very clear family-friendly policies and family-friendly spaces. That includes at work, it includes in the health facilities, it includes all of these areas, because unfortunately, when our families need help, they come to us. And they cannot come to us, to a space that is not friendly to them. Madam Presiding Officer, confidentiality. That is an issue that continues to be a thorn in the side of Tobago. Yes, we are small. And because we are small, Madam Presiding Officer, it means that we have to do so much more to ensure that confidentiality is maintained. And I just want to take a second, because sometimes when we say confidentiality, people think we're talking about anonymity, and there's a difference. Anonymity means we don't know who we're dealing with, meaning the person, we don't have the name or the identity of the person. For example, if we send blood to a lab and we just have a number, the blood just sees the number, they don't know whose blood it is, which is very different to confidentiality, where you know the information, but because of your professional ethics, you are required by law, required by standards, not necessarily law, to keep that information to yourself. And I know for a fact that many of the people who need help simply refuse to come and ask for it because they know their information would be in the streets even before they've left the place where they sought help. So that has to be a critical part. And that includes within our social services sector, within our health sector, within the policing sector. That is critical. Now, Madam Presiding Officer, there's also an area where I think we have not been doing it in Trinidad and Tobago. But because this issue of intimate partner violence is so widespread, one of the tools that have been used in other places, and it seems to get pretty decent responses, is to implement intimate partner violence screening tools within, for example, the health service. And that needs to be done in a very specific way for it to actually work. One, it needs to be systematic. And when we say systematic, it means you don't just look at the person who looks like they've been beaten and ask the question. No. The same way you take blood pressure and blood sugar for practically everybody who walks into the health facility, Madam Presiding Officer, the same way you would ask every person who comes in these questions. So it needs to be systematic, so people know that it is part of the routine treatment. It's part of the routine care that is provided. It is also recommended, Madam Presiding Officer, that a very clear script is developed, because you don't want to leave it up to the individual professional to ask the way they want to ask the question, because how you ask a question and the wording and the phrasing and so forth influences the response that you get. You also, because this is a very sensitive area, having a script would allow the health professionals to practice ahead of time with their friends and family and so forth, to ensure that they are able to do it and able to to control the inflection and able to control their facial expression and those things when asking the questions. So it is recommended that you start with what are known as normalizing statements. An example. Next, I'm going to ask you questions about intimate partner violence, and these are questions that we ask all of our patients, so the patient knows this is a normal part of it. You also need to continue normalizing the discussion. And another way of doing that is saying, we know that couples argue. We know that there's usually tension and so forth. This is normal. But when you and your partner argue, do you or does this happen? So you're starting with this is normal. We understand that this is normal. But then you ask the next very specific question. And some of the questions that are recommended, and it doesn't need to be any very lengthy thing. If you are, one question could be within the last year, have you been pushed, shoved, slapped, hit, kicked, choked, or otherwise physically hurt by your partner or by an ex-partner? Another question, if the person is pregnant, since you've been pregnant, have you been hit, slapped, kicked, or otherwise physically hurt by someone? Another question, within the last year, has anyone forced you to have sexual activities that you did not want? Another question, a very simple generic, are you afraid of anyone? These are all standard questions that are used in intimate partner violence screening in health facilities throughout the world. And we can start implementing them here because we know it is happening and we just want to get the in to start the conversation with some people. Of course, I was about to say it doesn't need to be said, but the reality is in Tobago it probably does need to be said. These,
you have 8 more minutes speaking time.
thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. These screening questions need to be done in private. So we may need to reconfigure some of the areas where we do our health interviews to ensure that we have real privacy when we're asking these kinds of questions. We need to also ensure that the person who is doing it understands the importance of therapeutic communication, which means actually paying attention when the person is talking to you, not necessarily writing or scripting or doing things to let them know that your answer is really important to me. And probably most importantly, if there is a positive screening, meaning you recognize that yes, the answer to one or more of these questions is yes, what do you do? It is important to avoid statements that incite fear. And as much as we all want to do it, as much as we all want the next step to be, let's call the police, we've recognized that if that is the next statement, many victims don't answer correctly because they don't want that as their next option. That has been studied throughout. So instead, what is recommended is that we ask, do you want help at this time? Because the genuine answer could be no. And if you ask the question every time, one day you would probably get a yes response. You also offer the various options and the various choices. But you need to also encourage safety planning. Because, Madam Presiding Officer, one of the things that is a fact is that even though we continue to say to women in particular, why don't you leave your abusive partner? The reality is, Madam Presiding Officer, that the moment just before you leave and the moment right after you leave is the deadliest of moments. And the cases recently in Trinidad and Tobago that have met the airwaves are cases where the just left and are running or just trying to leave. So we need to ensure that whenever we have these conversations, even if it is with your friend or family or whoever that you're trying to help, a safety plan is absolutely critical. Because for many, many, many women, they are actually saving their lives by staying in the relationship at the time, because that is the safer of the options. Madam Presiding Officer, as I said at the beginning, I am hoping that this is not just one of those things where we come here and speak fancy, because there are people outside who are listening, and there are people outside who absolutely need our help. And as one of the individuals who I spoke with recently said, and let me pull up exactly what was said, and I'm closing with this, Madam Presiding Officer. The person who works very closely with victims and perpetrators in these situations says, and I quote, "The entire process can be overwhelming, and usually persons in the situations are confused, disoriented, and scared. It requires a lot of patience, care, and tenderness from responders. Confidentiality and respect is also needed." But the person ended by saying, "But the lack of resources makes this extremely difficult." We need to figure out, Madam Presiding Officer, how we could create a space where people can get the resources and can follow through the process from prevention all the way to response as seamlessly as possible, because in a situation like this, Madam Presiding Officer, we're talking literally life and death. Thank you.
Assistant Secretary in the Office of the Chief Secretary.
Thank you very much, Madam Presiding Officer. I am once again thankful for the opportunity to contribute to an motion and represent the people of Plymouth Golden Lane in this August House. The carnival season has concluded, and as an island, we are appreciative of the many successes we were able to achieve during this period. I would like to applaud specifically the managers, arrangers, and members of the two steel orchestras in my district, namely Tobago Panthers, resident in Golden Lane, and Plymouth Bethesda Steel Sensation, the band from Plymouth, for their participation in the panorama competitions locally and nationally. I congratulate Plymouth Bethesda Steel Sensation for their third straight win at the Tobago leg of the Junior Panorama. They have represented the residents of Plymouth outstandingly, and we are proud of them. Now, Madam Presiding Officer, to the business at hand. Madam Presiding Officer, the motion urges all Tobagonians to reject and eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls, and appeals to this House to grant the approval to form a committee of key stakeholders led by the Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development. This committee, when established, Madam Presiding Officer, seeks to use existing strategies, find new ones, and implement them to address gender-based violence, thereby giving support to the commitment statement made at the Nairobi Conference in November 2019. Madam Presiding Officer, the commitment statement by the United Nations Women at the Nairobi Summit in November last year indicates that the United Nations Women fully support the program of action proposed at the International Conference on Population and Development, which places the rights, needs, and aspirations of individual human beings at the center of sustainable development. Madam Presiding Officer, almost every day I scroll through Facebook, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service Facebook page, or listen to the news, and there is the plea to help me find some child or adult and in most cases, the gender is female. On the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service Facebook page, man granted bail for sexual touching of a female minor, 3 held in suspicion of trafficking minors. This is only a few of the headlines read too frequently. The spate of murder-suicides in Trinidad and Tobago cannot be forgotten. These are sad and painful news, news that no parent, family member, concerned and law-abiding citizen wants to hear. Madam Presiding Officer, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were developed to achieve within the next decade better living conditions for all. Importantly, in the list, gender equality is in the top 5. The human rights of women include their right to have control over and decide freely, Madam Presiding Officer, and responsibly on matters related to their sexuality, sexual and reproductive health. Their right to be free from coercion, discrimination, and of course, violence. Madam Presiding Officer, universal access to women's and girls' sexual and reproductive health and rights, the freedom from violence in all forms, are integral to the achievement of the goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, especially Goal 5, which focuses on gender equality and empowerment of women. Madam Presiding Officer, the recognition is evident in a number of international norms and accordances with which the government of Trinidad and Tobago has agreed. It is noteworthy, Madam Presiding Officer, that we, the residents of Trinidad and Tobago, understand the importance of gender equality, empowerment of our girls who will become women, and the acceptance of their rights as we seek to attain sustainable development and work towards elimination of violence at public and private levels. Madam Presiding Officer, gender and development, apart from our national goals, is guided by several mandates, included but not limited to: 1, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Commonwealth Plan of Action for Gender Equality, adopted 2005 to 2015, that's the period, the CARICOM Plan of Action, the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development entitled The Future We Want, adopted in 2012, and at the 66th session of the General Assembly, the conference gave recognition to the importance of gender equality and women's empowerment across 3 pillars: 1, sustainable development, economic, social, and environmental. Madam Presiding Officer, the participants at this conference resolved to promote gender equality and women's participation in sustainable development policies, programs, and decision-makings at all levels in their respective territories. I continue, Madam Presiding Officer, on the principles and activities that guide gender development, and I mention, in addition to the 4 earlier, Principle 20 of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development of the year 1992, and finally, the World Conference on Women held in Beijing in 1995. At this conference, there were 12 areas of concern. Among them were violence against women, human rights, and the girl child. The government of Trinidad and Tobago was a part and major contributor to these conferences and conventions. Madam Presiding Officer, according to the combined 4th to 7th periodic reports compiled by the members of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in 2015, the report on page 12 states that the government of Trinidad and Tobago remains committed to the implementation of concrete measures aimed at promoting gender equality, equity, and elimination of violence against women and girls. Madam Presiding Officer, the government is committed to this cause, and the groundwork has been laid. Where before I came on the scene, Madam Presiding Officer, this issue of violence against women and girls has been getting attention. A lot has been accomplished, as mentioned by my colleagues earlier, and of course we understand that there are many gray areas. The Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago has passed several pieces of legislation aimed at protecting our children and women. These include, but not limited to, the Children Authority Act 2000, the International Child Abduction Act 2008, the Children Act 2012, the Sexual Offences Act, of course, of 1886, the Sexual Offences Amendment Act 2000, the Domestic Violence Act 1999, the Offences Against the Persons Act, very early 1925, and the Equal Opportunity Act 2000, and finally, the Trafficking in Persons Act of 2011. The legislations have limitations, Madam Presiding Officer, but the work is unfinished. The National Youth Policy for the period 2012 to 2017 charged the then Ministry of Gender, Youth and Child Development with the responsibility of developing and empowering young people across the nation from ages 12 to 29 to make informed choices through their programs that they undertook. In more recent times, 2019 and 2020, this year, the Ministry of Sport and Youth Affairs launched a LEAP program with the same vision in mind. Even at the level of our primary schools, Madam Presiding Officer, health and family life education was introduced as part of the curriculum, serving the same purpose. The efforts are being made to reach our young men and women. My appeal to them is to access. Madam Presiding Officer, the United Nations Women in 2019 supported the Nairobi Statement on ICPD 25. By supporting this motion, we are signaling our commitment to the statements documented then. We are agreeing to build momentum toward all women and girls living a life free from all forms of violence. We are agreeing to drive critical partnerships. We are agreeing to provide a continued platform for young women and girls to advocate for their rights and, of course, for training. And, of course, we are agreeing to accelerate and sharpen our focus on empowering our communities. Madam Presiding Officer, we in Tobago are concerned for the safety of our women and girls against the threats of violence, including trafficking, sexual and other types of exploitation. The information, though mentioned before, is worth repeating. The IDB study indicated, as mentioned before, that 1 in 3 women were victims of intimate partner violence in Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to say thank you to the Minority Councillor for the info she shared, read domestic violence and, of course, intimate partner violence. Ms. Alina Dudnath documented on the 1st of May 2019 that a recent study of over 1,000 women across Trinidad and Tobago has shown that 1 in 3 women has suffered from violence at the hands of their partner. According to Alina Dudnath, the 2017 Trinidad and Tobago Women's Health Survey, the first of its kind in this country, analyzed the prevalence of intimate partner violence in a survey involving 1,079 women across Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Presiding Officer, the study which was carried out by IDB looked at incidents of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse and the effects on women, including their health and their ability to work. The most common acts of intimate partner violence, as per the study, involve being slapped or having something thrown at you, being pushed or shoved, and being hit with a fist or object. Madam Presiding Officer, Ms. Dudnath stated that the Minister of State in the Office of the Prime Minister, in charge of Gender and Child Affairs, the Honorable Ayanna Webster Roy, said that, and I quote, "These statistics are way too high. Nevertheless, the data from this study and previous studies and the data emerging from the Domestic Violence Registry has uncovered certain shared commonalities. They all found that our country experiences a high level of gender-based violence and we cannot continue in this vein," unquote. The study states that near 1/3 of our women have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime. This is way too high for a country of 1.4 million people as this translates into approximately, as mentioned before, 130,000 women in our population having experienced some form of violence. Madam Presiding Officer, be it resolved that this House urge all Tobagonians to reject and eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls. Madam Presiding Officer, despite innovative legislations, policies, and programs, violence against women and girls remains a serious reality that is being perpetuated by deeply rooted traditional male control attitudes which seem to be tolerated by society. Change in mindset is necessary. Madam Presiding Officer, we are witnessing a spate of murder-suicide among our families in our country. It is in this regard that we ask this noble House to urge all Tobagonians to reject and eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls. And be it further resolved, Madam Presiding Officer, that this House form a committee of key stakeholders led by the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development to pilot the division strategy for eliminating all forms of gender-based violence, as well as support the committee, support the commitment statement made at the Nairobi conference in November 2019. Madam Presiding Officer, there is no reinvention of the wheel, just a continuation of the work that has already started, building and improving on what has been done. Therefore, I stand in support of the motion as a mom, as a woman, as a daughter, as an aunt, and as a Tobagonian. I stand in support of the motion as tabled by the Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development. And I say to all of us, we will get it right together, and all concerns will be addressed. I thank you.
Secretary for Health, Wellness and Family Development.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer, and thank you to my colleagues who contributed to this debate on this motion. Clearly, Madam Presiding Officer, there is agreement that the issue with respect to violence against women and girls is a priority. Clearly, this is an area that there is convergence of views. So as I wrap up, I want to place a few things on record. One, the issue with respect to violence against women and girls is a cost our island and our country must pursue because it is impacting the GDP of our country. Notwithstanding the challenges with respect to availability of resources, together we are expected to harness resources that are available such that we could confront this particular issue. We agree as well that this VAWG is a public health problem to the extent that it is impacting all our families. We agree as well that there's a role for other organizations, be they NGOs, CBOs, FBOs. We note as well that the involvement and participation of all these groups, this is necessary if we have to address this vexing issue. We note as well there are several roles for healthcare givers, roles for social workers, roles for lawmakers, law providers, law protectors. There are roles for each of those groups, but I dare say the complexity of these roles require all of us to examine how these roles intersect. We recognize the safety of our women and girls in Tobago is a major concern, and to that extent, our girls, in the case of this division, have been housed at the community residence for children at risk, supported by the state within the context of the Children's Authority Act. We note as well that there are several at-risk groups that must be considered as we pursue. However, this is the task that we must face. We've indicated this is a widespread problem, this problem of violence against our women and girls. We recognize the negative consequences associated with that. We recognize that in the case of our children, this will affect their school performance. We recognize that those at work will be so affected. And therefore, the issues with respect to managing these situations at school, at work, in communities require attention. This, we know, is not an easy task. And so, in every sphere in which we work, we expect that we will all be called to action. We note the role of the state in terms of the tapestry of legislation. We note the several conventions that have been put in place. However, we are still dealing with human beings. Legislation and conventions are insufficient to deal with this matter. It requires that each and every one of us come together on this issue. Our island requires our support. Our island requires each of us to work together in the interests of our women and girls. The issues with respect to the division and some of the areas that we want to table as we continue to deal with this issue, because we believe that we cannot continue to tolerate the deprivation of the freedom of our women and girls. We believe that we must work towards equality for men and women, so women and girls or men and boys. And therefore, much of what has been discussed is relevant to this discourse. May I add as well that the appropriate policies that we need as we go forward are necessary, and therefore our engagement with stakeholders is necessary as we build out a policy that is robust enough. In the case of the national setting, an interministerial committee was already set in place on a national scheme of things, and there is expected to be representation by the Tobago House of Assembly in that regard. But several areas still require attention. I pointed earlier that this requires a public health approach, and therefore scaling up of our prevention mechanisms are important for us. The fact that we require capacity building is another area, because we know that we need to do so. And so our frontline persons, whether they are in the police service or in the social service or wherever they sit, they too have to pay attention to a few things. The issue of collection and management of records or management of information, and the discussion around confidentiality and shared confidentiality is relevant. The difficulty, though, we can't manage the situation without shared confidentiality. We need to design, I think, as we come together, a more comprehensive communication strategy, because while we sweep it under the carpet, there's still need for us to communicate what is happening in our communities. The data that we collect and the understanding of the use of the data, that too is of importance, and many of us understand what the definitions are. We are not alien to what it is. This particular motion speaks to VAWG, it is only speaking to violence against women and girls, but within the context of men and boys, women and girls. And within that, we point to gender-based violence. We know we have to operationalize, as it were, those persons affected, those who are victims of, and we have provided some services which are by no means enough. And so survivors continue to come to us for support, and therefore issues with respect to adequacy of accommodation, trained counselors and all of that, those are to be attended to. But there are some specific areas that I want to just quickly point to as we close. The efforts we have made already in terms of our program for adolescent mothers is worthy of noting. And so too are interventions that we have made up until the time that we have had our Women's Empowerment Center. And we want to thank the staff who have continued to work to ensure that we, one, provide a service in the program for adolescent mothers, and the soon-to-be relocated the Women's Empowerment Center. It is difficult to find safe shelters for all of the persons who present us, and therefore collaborations with other providers will be necessary. The issues with respect to males and boys, so men and boys, a discussion that we've not dealt with adequately, requires our attention. And so as we go forward, we expect that whereas we have the problem with respect to violence against women and girls, the discussion with respect to men and boys must engage our attention. The models in which and the designs we use for the provision of care, that too requires attention, because the caregivers are expected to be adequately trained to respond to the needs of those persons presenting. The mainstreaming of gender in all that we do is an area that we have started to do and will continue, because we need to see all these activities through a gender lens, and we expect that most people will join us with respect to that. A major area is that of advocacy, because oftentimes this particular issue of gender-based violence, or the violence against women and girls, sufficient persons aren't advocates for the eradication of this. We tend to shy away from or sweep it under the carpet, as it were. And so some of the things that we must do as we go forward is, one, that we commit to this particular task, as mammoth as it is. Two, that all stakeholders, be they NGO or government, that we come together, because this is a whole of society issue that we must confront. Three, that the framework that we have to work within from our level, that we quickly work towards and reshape that such that it can respond more adequately to the needs of those persons affected. For the persons who are to interact with the victims, that we train them adequately. And the policy framework within which we have to engage and interact, that we look at that to see the extent to which that can provide a reference point for what we do. I want to thank as well my two colleagues who have contributed to this discourse. May I say that the elimination of violence against women and girls, as far-reaching as it is, we intend to confront this as an executive and as an island and as a country. And that for all those persons who are willing and able, we look forward to your volunteerism as we seek to create a safe space for our women and girls. For those persons who have been affected, we apologize for the kind of environment in which they have to live. We hope we could do more, and we want to do more for them as a division. And because of that, we have strengthened our community social work unit. We have strengthened there. And I said earlier, our program for adolescent mothers, we have strengthened that area. And we look forward to doing much more. And so as the motion says, that whereas this fifth goal in the SDGs, the second target of which is to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls in public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. And whereas the safety of our women and girls and whereas the safety of our women and girls against the threat of domestic violence and other forms of abuse is as a concern to us, we resolve that this House urges all Tobagonians to reject all forms of violence against our women and girls. More importantly, we look forward to key stakeholders working with us to leverage those areas such that we can eliminate all forms of violence. As I close, I thank all those persons who have contributed, and we look forward to your participation, and we commit that at this time, and I'm hearing that oftentimes one does not see the output of the various committees. This particular issue is one that is important for all of us, and we need all hands on deck as we proceed with this matter. We thank you very much, and I move this motion.
Members, the question proposed is, whereas under the 5th United Nations Sustainable Development Goal of gender equality, the second target is to eliminate all forms of violence against all women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. And whereas the safety of our women and girls against the threat of domestic violence and other forms of abuse continue to be a concern for us here in Tobago, be it resolved that this House urge all Tobagonians to reject and eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls. And be it further resolved that this House form a committee of key stakeholders led by the Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development to leverage the division's strategy for eliminating all forms of gender-based violence, as well as support the commitment statement made at the Nairobi conference in November 2019. All in favor say aye. Any against? The ayes have it. The motion is carried. Leader of Assembly Business.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I beg to move that this House now stand adjourned to a date to be fixed.
Members, the question is that this House now stands adjourned to a date to be fixed. All in favor say aye. Any against? The ayes have it. This House now stands adjourned to a date to be fixed.